make a phone call.
Sure.
Try to stay on a little bit, but believe it or not, we've got some issues, as you all know.
Good evening, and thank you for joining NYSUT Women Vote 2020, a commemoration and education on the 19th Amendment. My name is Jolene DeBrango, and I am the Executive Vice President for the New York State United Teachers, and I am also the Chair of NYSUT's Women's Committee. It gives me great pleasure to get our evening started by introducing our NYSUT President, Andy Pallotta. Andy certainly knows about the importance of voting and how much elections matter. He knows the source of true power in our democracy is our vote.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction, Jolene. It's my pleasure to join you today in commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. I gotta say, I love tonight's event title, NYSUT Women Vote 2020. It's clear, when women vote, we all win. While the presidential election has monumental importance this year, there are also many congressional and state races that can make a big difference on the issues that are important to us. NYSUT's 2020 virtual endorsement conference took place in July, and we issued a full slate of endorsements in state elections. We also made recommendations to the NEA and AFT in congressional races. I encourage you to visit nysut.org for a full list. Later tonight, you'll have the opportunity to help get out the vote. And if you'd like to stay involved with political activism, reach out to your regional political organizer. We're always looking for members to help out with phone banking and other activities. Enjoy tonight's important event. Back to you, Jolene.
Thank you, Andy. Let me also thank our special guests scheduled to be with us this evening, beginning with our keynote speaker, New York State Majority Leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, Interim Commissioner of Education, Dr. Betty A. Rosa, and Executive Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Labor, Natalie Carey. These women of distinction are doing important work every day that is improving the lives of all New Yorkers. We are deeply honored that these busy women have joined us this evening. Before I introduce our first speaker, I want to pause and talk about why we are here tonight. The women of NYSUT have created this event to commemorate the centennial of women's suffrage. This was a pivotal moment in our nation's history. But like many milestones in our nation's march toward justice and equality, the 19th Amendment wasn't perfect. Achieving the right to vote was hard fought, but it didn't include all women. The words enshrined in the 19th Amendment may have guaranteed women the right to vote, but many women of color were denied this right because of systemic racist laws and policies that included Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses that were specifically passed to disenfranchise women of color. These were some of the very same laws that denied men of color the right to vote. So, as NYSUT women, we asked ourselves, how do we honor this massive voting rights achievement? By creating a forum to highlight this feat, by teaching about the women who helped make it possible, but who were left out of our history books, and by giving today's women tools to build capacity and take action so every woman has her voice heard in 2020 and for the next 100 years. You see, there is no gender equity without racial equity. There is no gender equity without LGBTQ equity. There is no gender equity without disability rights equity. No woman can be left behind this time. That's why tonight you will hear from a diverse group of NYSUT women who will talk about our central theme. It all boils down to one word, ACT, A-C-T. The A is for awareness. Throughout tonight's program, NYSUT women will share with you what we are calling our suffrage seconds, an introduction of an unsung heroine, so that together we can become more acquainted with our powerful sisters, strengthening our awareness of bold women in history. The C in ACT stands for capacity building. You'll hear from NYSUT women on how to build capacity in your community, how to form coalitions, and tackle issues important to all women. And finally, the T. The T in ACT stands for taking action. Later in the program, we will be providing ways for you to take action as we approach the 2020 presidential election. An election that could, for the very first time in our history, elect a Black and South Asian American woman, Kamala Harris, as our next vice president. But before we get to all of that, I just need to ask our producers, do we have our keynote speaker?
Yes, we do, Jolene. Go right ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you. I have the privilege of introducing one of the great voices and a person who has been such a part of the history, revolution, and evolution of women leaders in New York's long history, Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins. Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins' life and story has been one of firsts and one of overcoming barriers. Majority Leader Stewart-Cousins is a former educator who taught English in Yonkers Public Schools and understands that education matters and that all of our kids deserve an excellent public education. In 2012, she became the first woman and African-American woman to lead a New York State legislative conference. In 2019, Andrea shattered the glass ceiling when she was elected as temporary president and majority leader of the state Senate. Right out of the gate, Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins has led one of the most productive sessions in state history. Leader Stewart-Cousins has overseen the passage of historic legislation on issues including voting reforms, tenant protections, gun safety, women's rights, immigration and dreamers, the LGBTQ community, the justice system, sexual harassment, and most recently, confronting COVID-19 and sweeping policing reforms. I now introduce to you Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins.
Thank you so much, Jolene. It's so good to be part of this celebration of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the amendment of women's right to vote. And this could not be a more important time where we review that history and we talk about what we can do to make sure that we are progressing. We're obviously at a point that our votes are going to matter, and our votes are going to matter more than ever before. And we have to really take advantage of the power that women have as a result of this journey that took well over 100 years, but certainly ended in the ratification of the 19th Amendment. When I'm thinking about talking to teachers, and it's just really nice that you all asked me to do this, and I know Andy's not on, but the relationship that I naturally have with NYSUT, with its members, certainly with teachers, is not only because I was an educator, but because I always will be an educator. And we know that education is the key. It's the great equalizer. And we're at a point that we also, I think, recognize that a lot of what we thought we know, we don't actually know. And a lot of things that we believed actually have to be drilled down a little bit farther. And it's the voices of the educators that will help us during these incredibly difficult times to drill down, to unpeel that onion, and to make people understand really where we are in the history and why it is so important that we, certainly we as women, participate. When I was through the history and they talked about obviously the names we know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and then there are all these other names that we don't hear much of, whether it's Ida B. Wells, whether it's, Sojourner Truth and this thing. I was amazed to know that Susan B. Anthony was not at Seneca Falls. She wasn't there. I mean, she and Cady Stanton had called, whatever the reason, she was not there. There was one Black person at Seneca Falls, and it was not a woman. It was Frederick Douglass. And the conversation around voting and what it meant for women, the ratification of the 15th Amendment that allowed for Black men to vote, and then this kind of roiling around, well, what about women's votes? And the division and the schism in many ways, because women, wanted the vote, obviously. And by the same token, because there had been so much segregation, allowing a new class of people to vote, as in Black women or even Black men, would then allow for people maybe to vote against policies that had been so discriminatory. So you can understand that people were of maybe 2, 3, 4 minds. Oh, I want the vote, but do I want them to vote? If I let them vote, will they be mad enough to get rid of me? That is the power of the vote. And that was the decision making that went on, fortunately, for all the right reasons, with all the complex stories. Women fought, white women, Black women, Native women, queer women, Asian women fought to get the right to vote. And it was achieved. Obviously, in different states, we know that, again, the Chinese women weren't allowed because there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and somewhere in the 1920s, I think 1924, they were able to get the vote, or maybe it was 1943. But then there was Native Americans who weren't even considered citizens, although, by the way, they were native to this land, but they were not part of the conversation at that point. So, and for Blacks, male and female, it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act in 1964 that people were actually allowed to vote without having to count how many bubbles on a bar of soap or how many jelly beans in a jelly bean jar. The fight for that right was a fight because people understood that once people had the right to voice their opinion, if they didn't like something, they could change it. And that's where we are. That's where we always are. But I don't think it's ever been more stark and more obvious than now. We're fighting for not only our own dignity, I feel, as people, as a diverse nation, as people who understand the power of not the poorly educated, but the well-educated, and are willing to invest in public education and public schools. We are fighting for the ability for the next generation and the next generation to be able to continue the progress and to learn from our history so that we don't repeat history that will only bring us more pain and more separation. We also need to learn from others' history so that we don't repeat their mistakes. That's what we're fighting for. We're fighting for an opportunity for women to take their rightful place. We hold up half of the world. And the fact that I lead an amazing conference of 40 people, 14 of them happen to be women. But out of 63 members, that's approximately 30%. We hold up half the world. And yet our government does not reflect that. And what do we do when we come? I think, Jolene, you were very kind to talk about the sweeping things that we were able to do. And obviously, everybody's not going to love everything. But the reality is that so many things that happened in 2019 when I was able to become the leader in that historic session with these amazing public servants. Look what we got done. Whether it was voting reform, whether it was the environmental things, whether it was sensible gun things, even we were able to be helpful in terms of getting rid of linking Common Core and teachers' evaluation. And I mean, we did so many things in so many ways that people really just couldn't stop writing about the history we made. And why did we make that history? Because we understood that people have been waiting for a revolution to take place in our value of women's rights and LGBTQ rights, and making sure that our children are honored and that we're focusing really on how they are going to be educated properly, how our teachers are going to have the resources they need. They knew that once we got a chance, we would be able to really change the conversation. And because I know that not only this is a unique position, but because voting is what creates the differences in every session, I knew that I had to hit the ground running because it was an opportunity that no woman had had before me. And I did not want to squander it. And that's where we are. We are at a place where if we don't vote, if we don't mobilize everyone we know to vote, we are squandering our opportunities. We are letting people say that it's perfectly okay the way it is and that we don't really need any change. And if we do have change, I don't necessarily want to voice my opinion on what that might be. Too many people, all of our ancestors, have fought too hard for us to be in the place where we are. We can't squander the opportunity. We can't disrespect their legacy. And we have no choice, frankly, than to use the power of the vote, which are the power of our voices, to continue the progress that we've made. I am so happy again to be here. I know you're going to talk to my good friend, Dr. Betty Rosa as well, another incredible pioneer. I just think that we as women have not only the responsibility, but really the imperative to use everything we have in this 100th year laid out so beautifully to prove what the power of our vote can really do. So please use it and know that you've got a friend, a champion, and an ally who will listen, as will the members of my conference. And we are so proud and so happy to be part of what we understand is not only a revolution, but an evolution and certainly progress. So thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, Senate Majority Leader Stuart Cousins, for this call to action. Clearly, none of us can sit this one out, and particularly women. Thank you so much again for your words, for your comments, and for your time this evening.
Thank you.
And now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Betty A. Rosa. Dr. Rosa is the Interim Commissioner of Education and President of the University of the State of New York. Dr. Rosa was appointed as Interim Commissioner this month by the Board of Regents, where she served as the Chancellor. Dr. Rosa was elected by her Board of Regents colleagues as Chancellor in March 2016 and re-elected for a second term in 2019. She was first elected to the Board of Regents for a 5-year term in 2008 as the Regent for the 12th Judicial District, then re-elected for a second term in 2013 and a third term in 2018. Dr. Rosa is a nationally recognized education leader and received a master's in education and a doctor of education in administration, planning, and social policy from Harvard University. She also holds 2 other Master of Science in Education degrees, one in administration and supervision, and the other in bilingual education from the City College of New York and Lehman College, respectively, and a BA in psychology from the City College of New York. She has more than 30 years of instructional and administrative experience with an expertise in inclusive education, cooperative teaching models, student achievement, and policy implementation. Dr. Rosa began her career in the New York City Department of Education as a bilingual paraprofessional, teacher, and reading coordinator, and served as an assistant principal and principal in special education. Dr. Rosa was also appointed to the position of Superintendent of Community School District 8 in the Bronx, and later appointed to serve as the Senior Superintendent of the Bronx. Again, it is my honor to introduce to you Dr. Betty A. Rosa. Dr. Rosa.
Thank you. First and foremost, let me start by saying I'll give a shout out to all the women in this state, and particularly our majority leader that has absolutely encourage many of us to stay focused, to stay not only focused, but to stay on the course and on the path. And the one thing that is amazing for me is that she leads with elegance and always reminds us to make sure that when they go low, you stay as high as possible. And so for that, I have so much respect and gratitude for not only her leadership, her friendship, and the fact that I always look to her and her beautiful scarves. So,
I love the one this evening. The one this evening is gorgeous and very appropriate for tonight.
and that is something we usually, whenever we're in the same space, we're in the same space, we always talk about, I could go with something I have. So, Jolene,
We're still women, right? We still it's the scarves, it's the hats, you know, we still get it done.
That's right.
absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Jolene. So good evening to everyone. I am so happy to join you tonight to celebrate Women's Equality Day and to make sure that we all remember this incredible journey. The majority leader has taken us down the path of a bit of her teaching in terms of history. So I too, as a former teacher, always a teacher, was going to take you down that same road. So I'm going to switch it up a little bit and talk about, while the past 100 years certainly is quite a benchmark, it's amazing to think that some of our own grandmothers and great grandmothers didn't have the right to vote. When you really, really think about it, it is something that too many people today take for granted. I would even bet that some of those joining us tonight have heard stories about the women in their own families who joined the suffrage movement and fought for votes in the early 20th century. We are truly grateful to those women who came before us to advocate for equality and who laid the cornerstone to allow us to take our place in this democracy. New York was one of the leaders in making sure that women had a voice. New York celebrated its centennial of giving women the right to vote in 2017. We had an amazing exhibit at the State Museum with recognition by the Board of Regents, the state and the department, and our legislators. Our history in the suffrage movement is long and storied. Many times we have heard, as the majority leader said, of some of the women that have led this movement, but there's also been a silence of some of the other women of color. I think it's so important that as we venture into the next generation, that we find and we recognize, and that our history, our curriculum, give way to honoring all the women of color that have made these contributions. While many of us know that Elizabeth Cady Stanton did lay some groundwork, just as Susan B., as you said, Susan B. Anthony, there were others that really made contributions. You made reference to Frederick Douglass and the 15th Amendment. And the fact that Frederick Douglass was a big women's suffrage proponent, but at the same time, that dual purpose of also trying to make sure that Black men had their rights. We also know that there are other names, and we want to make sure that in our history classes, we acknowledge those other names. African American women were largely left out of the conversation. Suffrage clubs at local and state levels were mostly segregated in New York State. At the national level, organizers were focused to cater to the Southern delegations, which refused to allow Black women to participate on any level. Giving women the vote in the South, when you think about it, took an incredible turn. To combat this, African American women in New York State and across the North formed their own clubs to advocate for the suffrage and anti-discrimination. One example is Phyllis Wheatley Club in Buffalo, which was organized by one of those unsung heroes, Mary Burnett Talbert. She was a noted educator and activist in the suffrage. She was an anti-lynching and anti-racism movement, and also a founding member of the NAACP. But her name may not be one that you know, and it should be one that you know. It is our job to bring these names forward. It is our job to unearth many of the contributions of those that have not taken their rightful place. We can do this through our classrooms. We can do this through making sure that our history, not our single story, is known. Most of us know that despite the passage of the 19th Amendment, many Black women in the South, and even some in the North, had to wait until the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act before they could vote. That's more than a half a century, if you think about it. That's why, in many ways, many are deeply troubled by this issue. Last November, just under 23% of New Yorkers voted in Election Day. Not even a quarter of those who can vote actually went to the polls. We can and must do better. So many people throughout history fought for this right. We must come out and vote. We must educate our young people on the importance of this issue. We have a rare and special platform as educators to reach young people who, as you know, are the future. We can work together to change that by working to get out the vote and to do everything we can to make sure that we together work on this mission. I mentioned earlier that the State Museum had a wonderful exhibit, Votes for Women. While the exhibit has been closed, there are numerous resources to help bring history to life in your classrooms, including our Educators Guide and graphic organizers. They're all available on the museum website. We must take advantage of these issues. We must make sure that we also celebrate. And I want to pause for 1 second. When I joined the Board of Regents, we had 3 females. Today, we have 10. And we did not have but one female of color. And I have to say that the Senate and the Assembly, in their wisdom, realized that in order to change, in order to make sure that we had voices, that we had to create a diverse institution that for 243 years has only had 2 women and only 1 female of color. And so I am honored to have been the first female of color, the second female, but the first female of color, of a father, an Afro-Latino father, and a mother who absolutely made her mark, as well as someone who struggled in the Bronx to go through her nursing career, to give her children, when my parents did divorce, give her children that sense of having the inner strength to make sure that you knew that everything and anything was possible. I will always be Betty from the Bronx. I will always be the young woman who made it to Harvard, but the Bronx was never taken from me. And so I came back to the Bronx to give back. I come now to the state to give back. I'm honored to know that many, many of our women are so committed to this issue, but we must remember that we are the future to our young women, and we represent the fact that they will see us just as they see the majority leader. They will see us as the future of the state and the future of this country. And with that, I conclude. Please get out and vote. Please know that tomorrow can only be better if we become an inclusive society and know that we have to walk away from the fact that we have too long told the single story. We must tell the stories of many other women, many other individuals that have contributed to this society and this nation. God bless everybody.
Thank you, Commissioner Rosa. It is clear that there is a theme emerging. No one can sit this election out. And again, women that, as Leader Cousins said, hold up half of the world. Your points about not having women in our history books, not teaching women to our students is so incredibly powerful and important. And coming from the Commissioner of Education, it means the world to all of us on this event tonight as educators. And on a personal note, I just want to say that taking on a leadership role like this as the interim commissioner of the state of New York during this period of crisis takes real courage and strength. And everyone on this event tonight can see that you have been a champion for educators, for the people that educators serve, the students and children of New York, and certainly for women. And you have been a champion for all of us like that your entire life. So thank you again, Commissioner. I now turn to Natalie Carey. Natalie Carey has been an inspiration and mentor for women in the workplace throughout her career. She is the first woman of color to hold the position of Executive Deputy Commissioner of the New York State Department of Labor. In 2018, she was named Resourceful Woman of the Year by the YWCA of the Greater Capital Region and Woman of Strength by the Rockefeller College Center for Women in Government. She is a true champion for women's equality and continues to fight for diversity and inclusion for all. She joins us in celebrating Women's Equality Day and the passage of the 19th Amendment. After hearing from Natalie, may we all be inspired to use our voices to make a difference. Natalie.
Thank you to the New York State United Teachers President, Andy Pallotta, and Executive Vice President, Jolene DeBrango, for inviting me to participate tonight. It is such a great honor to speak with you all this evening. The passage of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was a momentous achievement. The women who marched for and fought for this right understood the importance and power of representation in the electoral process. It meant educational opportunities, securing workplace rights, and protection against sexual exploitation. At its core, the 19th Amendment meant independence and equality. As we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, we are all aware that this is a pivotal time in the history of our country and our state. And while the passage of the 19th Amendment was a remarkable step forward for women in our nation, I think it's also important to reflect upon the struggle that preceded this victory. Many of the heroines that were instrumental in the women's suffrage movement were still fighting the evils of racism and discrimination as women of color. We should not forget that the iconic Women's Suffrage March, the march that made it evident that women would not be silent, the protest for equality, was segregated, and women of color were required to march in the back. Some women, like Ida B. Wells, refused to march in the back of her state's delegation with almost 60 other women of color. Instead, she marched at the front alongside the rest of her Illinois delegation, simultaneously taking a stand against sexism and racism. I'm also personally inspired by the bravery of a group of college students who were heavily discouraged from participating in the first suffrage march under the threat of harm. These young women decided that what they were fighting for was worth the personal sacrifice. While those undergraduates may only be a footnote in the history books, their footprint is immeasurable. They were the founders of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and I remain a proud member to this day. Many of the women who fought for this precious right were not alive to see it come to fruition. They are the trailblazers that came before us, and we are their legacy. The fight, however, did not end with the passage of the 19th Amendment. It still took several years before this right was extended to all women, particularly women of color. While we celebrate the women's right to vote, we must also acknowledge that there are many more victories to be won. Our great state of New York has been a state of firsts. Seneca Falls, New York, hosted the first Women's Right Convention in 1848 and is known as the birthplace of the women's rights movement. I am proud to work for a governor who not only takes women's issues seriously, he prioritizes them. Governor Andrew Cuomo is progressive in fighting for women's equality and advancing policies that embrace diversity and inclusion. He has tackled workplace sexual harassment head-on, enacted the Marriage Equality Act granting same-sex marriage, improved coverage and access to breast cancer screening, mandated insurance coverage for in vitro fertilization, worked tirelessly to close the gender wage gap by raising the minimum wage and implementing the salary history ban, enacted the nation's strongest paid family leave program, and implemented comprehensive paid sick leave program for all New Yorkers. He continues to be a champion for women, and New York State continues to lead the way. As the first woman of color to hold the position of Executive Deputy Commissioner of the New York State Department of Labor, I have the privilege of meeting and working with women from all walks of life across our state. And in their stories and experiences, I find fragments of my own challenges and struggles. It saddens me to still hear their reports of racial and gender discrimination, as well as wage inequity, although we have made such strides and live in one of the most progressive states. While we have proven that we have the strength to break down the barriers that stand in our way, there is still more work to be done. The women that fought for the 19th Amendment united because they had a desire to be heard, to be seen, and to be counted. They were a group of strong and fierce women with a conviction to change the world for the better. They were a group of strong and fierce women making history, and we have an obligation to do the same. I'm inspired every day by the empowered and successful women I see throughout our workforce. I am also continually motivated to help our sisters who are still reaching for empowerment. Together, we must continue to stand up and demand better than the status quo. This is our time to be heard and to come together to fight for the things that unite us. Focusing on our differences will not make us stronger, but mobilizing our strength for the common goals that are at the core of what we believe, just like the women who came before us, will help us to write our own history. This year, our vote is more critical than ever. With your help, leaders like Governor Cuomo has led the way, and it is important that our voices be heard and used to elect more leaders who will continue to do the same. As we continue to fight for our basic rights, it is important to remember that there is no room for divisiveness in the fight for equality. If it harms one, it harms us all. If it benefits one, it benefits us all. Please, use your voice to leave your imprint on history, especially during these times, and to blaze a new trail. Thank you.
Thank you, Executive Deputy Commissioner of Labor, Carey, for those powerful words. Blaze a new trail we will. Now we turn our attention to the next part of our program, where we will hear from NYSUT women and how they've used their collective strength to create awareness of the 19th Amendment and those unsung heroines in the fight who were left behind. They are our NYSUT women trailblazers. It is my pleasure to introduce Barbara Hafner. Barbara is a 25-year educator and is the retired president of the West Hempstead Education Association, where she served for 18 years. She also served on the NYSUT Board of Directors in ED 18 for 13 years. She's a member of the Long Island Federation of Labor's Executive Board, vice president of NYSUT's Retiree Council 18, and a member of NYSUT's Women's Committee. She co-founded the local NYSUT Women's Chapter, NYSUT Women of Long Island. Barbara.
Thank you, Jolene. We started with the inspiration and leadership of our sister and NYSUT Executive Vice President, Jolene DeBrango, and the creation of the NYSUT Women's Committee in 2017. We were psyched, and so we grew. Our ED 18 tribe began last fall and included sisters from across Long Island. We were a small group with great plans to improve the lives of our union sisters and the female students in our care. But we didn't stop there. NYSUT women from all over Long Island and Westchester came together to find a way to recognize and honor the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment, while elevating the sisters who were left behind, increasing awareness of voter suppression, and encouraging actions to make lasting change. Our group decided to promote awareness of voting rights by sharing facts on social media during the entire month of August. Our plan was to educate and at the same time elevate the little-known factual course of our history.
Thank you, Barbara. I would now like to introduce Brianna Schmaliker. Brianna is a 9th grade English teacher and a member of the Central Islip Teachers Association and Political Action Committee. She's also a member of NYSUT's Women's Committee and NYSUT Women of Long Island. Brianna.
Thank you, Jolene. While we wanted to honor the centennial of the 19th Amendment, the fact remained that in 1920, not all women had the right to vote. We had to grapple with how to present history in a way that respects the progress without erasing the shortfalls. While doing the work to fight voter suppression today, we felt the strength of the suffragists before us. We saw where they excluded suffragists based on their race or progressive views. It became our purpose to create a project inclusive of all suffragists. This project tells the lesser known but equally important stories of those who were erased from the history books. As educators, we know that delivering information is important, but the true goal is to inspire. We hope that you take some time to read through our project and that it compels you to continue the work that began 100 years ago. Now is our time to not only exercise our hard-won right to vote, but to also ensure that every other American has the same opportunity.
Thank you, Brianna. And now I'd like to introduce Leslie Rose. Leslie is an elementary teacher in the Hewlett-Woodmere School District. Leslie's union roles in the Hewlett-Woodmere Faculty Association include Political Action Chair, a member of the Solidarity Committee, and a building representative. In addition, Leslie is a NYSUT delegate and member of the NYSUT Women's Committee. She co-founded the local NYSUT Women's Chapter, NYSUT Women of Long Island. Leslie.
Thank you, Jolene. With only our inspiration and sisterhood as a guide, we began to figure out our process. We didn't have a plan, but what we did have was an idea and a vision. We worked together to create a blueprint to educate a very different kind of audience from what we are used to. Before that first Zoom meeting of 18 downstate NYSUT women came to a close, a Google folder was started and research had begun. That's what happens when a group of teachers gets excited about a project. The work took shape and evolved as organically as it started. We quickly established workspaces, a Facebook group, text threads, group chats, Google Slides, Twitter moments, and soon to be Wakelet, where you will be able to easily access our work. The technology that we used for remote instruction this past spring gave us tools to support our vision. Our journey to create 31 Did You Know cards in 3 days was a learning experience for the teachers. Each awareness card is intended to teach about the unknowns as well as to inspire and create action. Every card was a labor of love. At times it seemed our quest for the truthful history of voting rights was insatiable. It was not unusual to find another sister in the slides in the wee hours of the morning. This powerful work was incredibly meaningful to each of us. Each card begins with the following statement. As we commemorate the centennial anniversary of women being granted the right to vote, we need to remember that women did not mean all women. To honor our suffragist sisters, we continue to fight for equality at the ballot box. Each day this month, we will share facts meant to inspire action. In sisterhood and solidarity, NYSUT women.
Thank you, Leslie, Barbara, and Rayanna. It should be noted that the work these women did all this month to raise awareness of the 19th Amendment and voting rights was truly the jumping off point for this entire event this evening and inspired our suffrage seconds, which are the facts about little-known women in the fight. Thank you all for your leadership. And now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Cheryl Hughes to read our first suffrage second. Cheryl is a member of the Kenmore Teachers Association and serves on the NYSUT Board of Directors. She is also a member of NYSUT's Women's Committee and is a founding member of the Western New York Regional Women's Committee chapter, which includes Buffalo, Kenton, West Seneca, and Williamsville. Cheryl.
Thank you, Jolene. I believe unconditionally in the ability of people to respond when they are told the truth. We need to be taught to study rather than believe, to inquire rather than to affirm. These are the words of Septima Poinsett Clark. At age 18, she taught in a one-room schoolhouse. She used her skills as an educator to help African Americans learn to read in order to pass Jim Crow literacy tests. Clark joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, in 1961 as Director of Education and Teaching. In 1962, the SCLC joined with the other organizations to form the Voter Education Project, which trained teachers for citizenship schools and assisted in increased voter registration among African Americans. Her idea for citizen education became the cornerstone of the civil rights movement. She also worked with Martin Luther King Jr. to win rights for African Americans. Septima Poinsett Clark. Remember her words, remember her name.
Thank you, Cheryl. Now I am honored to introduce Thea McFawn. Thea is the founder of the Capital Region Institute for Human Rights, which does transformative work with young people around issues of justice, equity, and equality. Thea is also a North Colony Central School District teacher and NYSUT member. Thea.
Thank you, Jolene. As a proud public school teacher and the founder of the Capital Region Institute for Human Rights, for the past 6 years, my colleague Kelly Weatherby and I have developed, organized, and hosted human rights symposiums for teens across New York State. During our programs, teens meet and learn from social justice advocates, community leaders, and educators. They work collaboratively to design projects to address needs in their schools and communities, and put into action what they've learned during our program. Over the years, teens have created projects to address gender equity, LGBTQ rights, climate justice, racial justice, economic justice, and education rights. In 6 years, we are proud to have mentored over 400 young people who are poised to be this generation's human rights leaders. This evening, I am delighted to introduce you to one of them, KJ Gordon. KJ is a senior at Shaker High School, a founding member of her school's Project Lit Book Club, a club where students facilitate conversations with peers and community members around diverse books. And she is also a Teen Summer Symposium intern. Tonight, she'll share with you her thoughts on the importance of voting and inclusive school curriculum. KJ?
Thank you for that introduction. This upcoming election is important to me because it's more crucial than ever to have a leader building up our Black communities. Young voters want to have their voices heard, have representation in office to bring change, and have a leader who reflects what we want to see in America. Personally, as a young Black woman, seeing Kamala Harris on the vice president ticket is huge for me. We've never seen this representation on a national stage. She is the first woman of color to accept a major party nomination for vice president. At a time of uncertainty, it's important for our young people to know they have power in using their vote, not only in presidential elections, but local elections too. Local elections are important because bills are passed every year that impact their quality of life and access to services. School board elections are one of the many local elections that are so important because a portion of our taxes dollar fund schools in our communities. School board members influence how that money is spent and the resources and programs that are made available to students. It is vital that we have the best interests of the young people in their community in mind. My friends and I have talked about voting, and one comment I've heard repeatedly is they don't know who to vote for. I think the lack of education on voting and political parties in schools makes young people feel blindsided when it comes for the actual time for them to vote. It is important for schools to encourage us to be more civically engaged and aware. Having teachers teach students starting in elementary school about voting rights, local elections, and how to contact our local officials will help us feel ready to cast our vote for a person who represents the changes we need to improve our country. Today is the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. From my personal experience in school, I was taught with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, women won the right to vote. It is often described as the largest expansion of democracy in our country's history. It was unclear to me until I did my own research outside of school that this didn't equally impact all women. African American and Native American women faced barriers that did not simply go away with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Discriminatory state laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, threats of violence, and lynching continued. African American suffrage Nannie Helen Burroughs spoke and wrote about these barriers, and although she worked with pivotal organizations like the National Women's Suffrage Association, they failed to address the challenges faced by Black women. African American suffrage Charlotte Horton started the National Association of Colored Women in 1896, which specifically addressed issues that affected Black women. Teaching an incomplete history impacts all young people and their understanding of the role of women of color and women's suffrage. It impacts young people like me because learning an incomplete history denies me the opportunity to fully understand how these heroes resisted, overcame, and ultimately succeeded. These women and many more should be taught because we have the right to know our nation's whole history and that women of color have fought hard for change and continue to do so. I see this upcoming election as the beginning of change. This election is incredibly important to young voters. We are looking for a new president to bring racial equity and balance the scales so that people of color have an equal opportunity in America. Young voters have an unprecedented opportunity to vote for positive and inclusive change this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Thea, and thank you, KJ. It is clear that our young people are watching us. And I don't know about all of you, but I feel better knowing that our future is in good hands with young people like KJ. KJ, thank you for sharing your perspective. It was powerful, and I really hope all the educators who are viewing this tonight are listening. Thanks again. And now I would like to introduce Maria Pacheco to read our second suffrage segment. Maria is the former president of the Mohannisan Teachers Association and serves on the NYSUT Board of Directors. She's an educator of 34 years and is also a member of NYSUT's Women's Committee. Maria.
There is a word sweeter than mother, home, or heaven. That word is liberty. These are the words of Matilda Daslin Gage, a woman suffragist, Native American rights activist, abolitionist, free thinker, and author. She was the youngest speaker at the 1852 National Women's Rights Convention held in Syracuse and rapidly became a leader in the women's rights movement. He offered her home to people escaping slavery when she was pregnant with her third child, facing thousands of dollars in fines and 6 months in jail for doing so. As an author, her writing highlighted the significant accomplishments of women in invention, military affairs, and history. She saw the social, religious, economic, and political positions of the Iroquois nation as far superior to her own. She supported Native treaty rights, recognized Native nation sovereignty, and was honorably adopted into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation. She was an unsung hero and pioneer for justice. Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Remember her words, remember her name.
Thank you, Maria. I would now like to introduce Aisha Cook to kick off our capacity building section of the program. Aisha is the chairperson of the New Rochelle Fuse Women's Committee and a member of both NYSUT's Women's Committee and AFT's Women's Committee. Aisha.
Thanks, Jolene. In November of 2018, I sat at a NYSUT Women's Committee conference, enjoying the sisterhood and solidarity of the time. I had been to a couple of these conferences in the past and expected a celebration of the advocacy and leadership of NYSUT women. There's something so powerful about being in a room with union women. We are fierce women who get the job done. Now, what I didn't expect was the ask. NYSUT Executive Vice President Jolene DeBrango asked us all to pay it forward. She asked us to start our own women's committees in our locals. Of course, right? In the midst of Janice, it only made sense to put women on the case. We are the majority of NYSUT. In our locals, we could focus on issues that are important to us. I immediately started thinking and planning. I had just planned the sticking with the union party for my local New Rochelle Fuse. I figured that would be the perfect place to sign up women for a new committee. I asked to borrow, well, I may or may not have returned it, the NYSUT I'm sticking with my union photo frame to use at the Fuse party. It's always easier to approach people when you have something they want. And I set off to sign up Fuse women to do this work. Fast forward a year and a half, and our committee of close to 20 women planned a robust Women's History Month celebration, complete with weekly activities focused on social justice, advocacy, community service, and self-care. Unfortunately, as you probably remember, COVID hit pretty hard during the month of March, and we postponed our events. But we all know that you can't keep good women down. We are so ready to hashtag use the 19th to get out the vote in this historic election, because hashtag NYSUT Women Vote 2020. Let's do this, ladies.
Thank you. Aisha, you were the first NYSUT woman to establish a NYSUT Women's Committee chapter. What has this sisterhood that you built meant to you and your fellow NYSUT women?
Well, Jolene, all women need a safe space to talk about things like their periods and getting sanitary supplies to teens in schools, domestic violence, and resources that are available to us. Research also shows that women need multiple asks to try something outside of her comfort zone. What better place to make that ask than in a room full of women? Sometimes women need other women to encourage them to be bold, to speak out, and to take risks. That's what women's committees provide.
Thank you, Aisha. Reading our next suffrage second is Joanne Sweat. Joanne is the president of the Buffalo Educational Support Team and a member of AFT's PSRP Council. She's a member of NYSUT Women's Committee and NYSUT's SRP Leadership Council. Joanne.
Thank you, Jolene. Suffrage for women was necessary to a successful democracy. These are the words of Dr. Mabel Ping Wu Lee. Although the 19th Amendment granted voting rights for all American women in 1920, Dr. Ping Wu Lee did not vote until 1943. As a Chinese immigrant, she was long denied citizenship due to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Without citizenship, she could not vote. Nevertheless, she and other Chinese suffragists worked tireless for women to vote, despite the fact they would not directly benefit. Dr. Mabel Ping Wu Lee. Remember her words, remember her name.
Thank you, Joanne. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Cordelia Anthony, who will focus on the importance of building community coalitions. Cordelia is the president of Farmingdale Federation of Teachers and serves on the NYSUT Board of Directors. Cordelia.
Thanks, Jolene. The struggle for women's suffrage in the United States was fought for by an army of women. Women from various socioeconomic and educational backgrounds decided to come together and build a movement to make change in this country. That type of coalition building is the blueprint that we need to continue to strive for today. We must make meaningful partnerships with local community groups, public service organizations, places of worship, and even be open to starting our own grassroots movements. Our mission is to make sure that we mobilize voters all over the country to exercise their right to vote. As we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, we also need to recognize that it wasn't the last time that the fight for suffrage would be waged. We are still in an era where other groups are being disenfranchised when it comes to obtaining their legal right to vote. We have to make sure we do whatever is necessary to stop any voter intimidation, polling place irregularities, or any other actions that would endanger our voting rights. There have been many people before us who fought hard and have died for these rights. They are expecting us to honor their legacy by continuing the work they started. By using the power of the lessons of developing and sustaining diverse alliances, they left us a roadmap on how to carry on that fight. The events of the past 4 years, and more specifically within the last 6 months, have made it abundantly clear that it is more important for us to truly come together and build coalitions in order to effect change. Whether you work with the League of Women Voters, Citizen Action, She Votes Inc., CBTU, or the Poor People's Campaign in their MORE campaign, mobilize, organize, register, and educate. Each of these groups and more are all going to be working hard to get out the vote. All of us must get involved in some way. Become more active in groups that you're already a part of. Make connections and build strategic coalitions so that our work on this common goal will be purposeful and sustainable. Many of our members have already answered this call to action. We currently have 29 active local women's committees chapters throughout the state. You can also make a difference on a national level by joining the NEA Women's Caucus. Our sisters, Lynn Garcia and Sue Rachelson, are members of the Buffalo Teachers Federation, and they both serve vital roles within the caucus. Lynn is the vice chair, and Sue serves as the Northeast Regional Coordinator. And we've also created a listing of various groups and organizations. So just click on the 2020 Women's Centennial Vote tab. You can find out how to join the NEA Women's Caucus there too. So, my sisters, let's make some good trouble. Thank you.
Thank you, Cordelia. If you are interested in forming a NYSUT's Women's Committee in your community or learning more about any of the things that you've heard this evening, go to nysut.org/women to get started. Our next Suffrage Second presenter is Donna Hope. Donna is the president of the Nassau Community College Federation of Teachers and a professor in the marketing department at Nassau Community College. She is also a member of NYSUT's Women's Committee. Donna.
Thank you, Jolene. We were sick and tired of being put down. These are the words of Sylvia Rivera, a bisexual, trans, Latinx activist. Sylvia advocated for the queer and transgender people that the gay rights movement had left out. She co-founded STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, in 1970. This organization aimed to achieve rights for the trans community and provide them with social services. But as a woman of Puerto Rican and Venezuelan descent, Rivera's activism also focused on intersecting issues of women's rights, poverty, and race, driving her to organize with feminists, the Young Lords, and the Black Panther Party. Sylvia Rivera. Remember her words, remember her name.
Thank you, Donna. Haven't these suffrage seconds been illuminating? We want to thank history teacher Dora Leland, who is also a member of our NYSUT Board of Directors and founder of NYSUT's Southern Tier Women's Committee, and NYSUT staff member Carolyn Williams for researching our suffrage seconds for this evening, after we were all inspired by the work done by our sisters from Long Island, who we heard from earlier this evening. Thank you, Dora, and thank you, Carolyn. Now we turn our attention to taking action. Tinica Wilcox is a grade 3 through 5 representative at large for Troy Teachers Association, a member of NYSUT's Women's Committee, and a chair of the Troy Teachers Association's Women's Chapter. Tinica.
Moment in history, whether it's civil or equal rights, fighting for the chance to have our voices heard, our bodies counted, and our lives matter. I know we say that every election is important, but I do not think we have ever had an election where everything we have ever fought for is at stake. You see, we are not just voting for a president. You're voting to stop a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Shout out to Ruth Bader Ginsburg for literally putting her life on the line for our freedom. You're voting for the next Secretary of Education, Housing Secretary, and Attorney General. You're voting for letting kids out of cages. You're voting for clean air and water. You're voting for scientists to be allowed to speak and do something to protect us from climate changes and pandemics. You're voting for dreamers. You're voting for teaching to be treated like the noble profession that it is. You're voting to defend women's reproductive rights and women's rights to make all health-related issues regarding her body. You're voting to acknowledge the humanity and protect the safety of our family and friends in the LGBTQ community. You're voting to stop the normalization of white supremacy and dangerous bigotry in the mainstream. John Lewis, who was beaten, his skull fractured, and arrested more than 40 times, all for us, just so we could register to vote. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act is his legacy. John Lewis sums it up best. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? We owe it to not only ourselves, but our ancestors and our future, our children, to exercise our right to vote, speak up, and be counted. I can't breathe. I'm waiting to exhale.
Thank you, Tinica. Now I would like to introduce Angie Rivera. Angie is the president of the Rochester Association of Paraprofessionals. She is a member of the NYSUT Board of Directors and member of the Rochester Women's Committee chapter, founded by NYSUT women Marnie Brady and Sheila Buck, which also includes fellow NYSUT board member Karen Artman. Angie.
Thank you, Jolene. Seeking no favors because of our color, nor patronage because of our needs. We knock at the bar of justice, asking for an equal chance. These are the words of Mary Church Terrell, an ardent suffragist and civil rights activist, and the mother of the sit-in after she picked the White House in 1919. She was an honorary member of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, the only African American women's group to participate in the march in Washington. Despite being told to march at the back of the parade, Mary Church Terrell joined them in the march. Terrell fought for women's suffrage and civil rights because she realized that she belonged to the only group in the country that has two such huge obstacles to surmount, both sex and race. She helped found the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, coining the organization's motto, "Lifting as we climb," and a charter member of the NAACP. She was a fighter for racial equality and justice throughout her entire life. Mary Church Terrell. Remember her words. Remember her name.
Thank you, Angie. To provide us with action steps developed by ED 13 NYSUT board member and Wallkill Teachers Association Vice President Melissa Servant and Tinica Wilcox is the Janella Hines from the United Federation of Teachers. Janella is the Vice President for Academic High Schools of the United Federation of Teachers. She serves on the NYSUT Board of Directors and is one of the founders of the annual UFT Her Story event. Janella.
Thank you, Jolene. So, are you inspired by this evening's event? Use the resources to start a NYSUT Women's Committee chapter in your local or region. Go to www.nysut.org/women. Go to www.nysut.org/womenvote, which will take you to the NYSUT Women's Committee voting resources page. Use any of the resources on that page to check your registration status. Register to vote if you need to. The deadline to register to vote in New York is October 9th. If you plan to vote by mail, request your ballot early and mail it in early. Take out your phone. If you do not have the NYSUT Member Action Center app, otherwise known as the NYSUT Mac app on your phone, download it to your phone for free. On our NYSUT Women's page, you will see the NYSUT Women Vote 2020 pledge. Please take the voting pledge and share it with your social media groups on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter with the following hashtag, NYSUT Women Vote 2020. Make your plans to vote. Early voting begins October 24th through November 1st. Use any of the resources on the NYSUT Women's page to find your poll location. Include in your plan reaching out to at least 5 women to confirm their voting plan. When NYSUT women vote, all women win. Speaking of women, NYSUT has endorsed several female candidates who are on the ballot this fall. Jackie Gordon, CD2, Monica Martinez, the former teacher, SD3, Jackie Berger, SD61, Chantel Jackson, AD79, and Dia Carabajal, AD126. Take your census if you have not. The link is on the NYSUT Women's page. Lastly, use our NYSUT Women Vote selfie placard. Take a selfie, share it on the NYSUT Women's Facebook page, Instagram, and Twitter timeline with the hashtag NYSUT Women Vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Janella. And thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you learned something new about the diverse group of women who fought for women's suffrage, and that you remember their words and remember their names. We hope you found some inspiration to build your own capacity in your community so all women have a safe space and place to thrive, to lead, and be heard. And finally, we hope you realize that this election is about who we value and what we value. At NYSUT, we value you, all of you, people from different backgrounds and experiences, and people who believe we must all lift as we climb. We must lift everyone. At NYSUT, we also value science and institutions like our Postal Service, public schools, and universities. And we need new leadership come November that will support us, all of us, and the people and things we value. Yes, NYSUT Women Vote, and NYSUT women are ready to act. And we hope you're ready too. We want to again thank our NYSUT President, Andy Pilata, New York State Majority Leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins, Interim Commissioner of Education, Dr. Betty A. Rosa, and Executive Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Labor, Natalie Carey. And we want to thank every single NYSUT woman and NYSUT staff member who put this program together so we could commemorate and educate on the 19th Amendment. And as we like to say on the NYSUT Women's Committee, behind every successful woman is a tribe of other successful women who have her back. Tonight, we demonstrated just that. Thank you for being with us this evening. Good night.